On a freezing morning in Chicago, disgraced ex-prosecutor Seren Caldera returns to the Daily Center expecting a routine hearing until the judge declares Dashiell Rivas innocent, the man she sent to prison for 10 years. Outside, under flashing cameras, he steps close and whispers, "You were certain." And that certainty buried me. Hours later, someone shoves Seren onto the CTA Red Line tracks at Roosevelt Station. She survives, but realizes this wasn't an accident. What if the case that made her career was built to destroy an innocent man? And what if the only way to save him is to ruin herself? Stay to the end, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. Seren Caldera hadn't been in a courtroom in almost 4 years, but the moment she stepped into courtroom 500 of the Daily Center, it was as if every misstep, every career-defining argument, every lie she told herself had followed her in. She sat quietly in the back, her coat zipped too high, her scarf still on, pretending she was just another civilian watching the city churn through another docket. The judge's voice carried over the polished oak walls, but Seren didn't hear much until the words "exonerated" based on new forensic evidence sliced through her like a paper cut. Dashiell Rivas stood in a wrinkled grey suit, thinner than she remembered, his wrists still marked from the shackles they'd just removed. The court clerk's voice cracked slightly as he read the order of release, and even the bailiff paused. Seren's stomach clenched. Not because the system had failed, it had, plenty of times, but because this time the failure wore her name. Her signature was on the file that buried him. She had framed it as certainty, as clarity back then. Today, it felt like a verdict against herself. As people began to whisper and journalists scribbled into Chicago Sun-Times notepads, Seren didn't move. She couldn't. Because Dashiell had turned. He saw her and walked toward her. Outside, the plaza between Washington and Clark buzzed with reporters, fumbling for quotes. The wind that day came off Lake Michigan in sheets, slapping against glass and skin alike. Seren tried to blend into the mass of coats and cameras, but Dashiell Rivas walked straight through it like he'd rehearsed it 100 times in prison. She barely recognized him now, older, carved thinner by years, but still holding himself with a precision that made her think of the closing arguments he never got to give. He stopped in front of her, just stopped. She opened her mouth, but nothing coherent came. "You had certainty," he said, and his voice wasn't bitter, it wasn't anything. "And that certainty buried me." The sentence didn't land like a slap. It settled, slow, like snowfall that doesn't melt. She blinked once, lips trembling, not from the cold. He turned and walked away, before she could speak, before she could beg. She watched his back fade into the bodies and city noise, her throat closing around words far too late to matter. A Channel 7 reporter angled her camera towards Seren, but she ducked her head and moved, boots crunching over icy concrete, fingers tightening around the copy of the case file still inside her bag, like a relic no one had asked to exhume. By the time Seren reached the Blue Line station near Jackson, her mind was spiraling with phrases that no longer fit reality. Every inch of her body wanted to forget the past, but her bag dragged with the weight of a man's stolen decade. She tapped her Ventra card with a jittery hand and rode in silence, swaying slightly with each shift in the tracks. Her phone buzzed once, spam, but when she glanced at the reflection in the plexiglass window, a black SUV had appeared behind her in the tunnel's curved glass. She exited at Darman, walked west toward Wicker Park, passing Reckless Records and a closed Big Star taqueria. The SUV kept reappearing, sometimes behind her, sometimes parked ahead, engine humming. It wasn't paranoia. Not this time. She crossed Milwaukee Avenue twice just to check. It followed. At North and Honoré, she cut hard into the crowd near the Walgreens and ducked into the subway again, descending toward the Roosevelt platform on the Red Line. Her heart was clawing at her ribs. As she paced, she thought about calling someone. But who? Her old boss wouldn't touch her now. The Public Integrity Unit barely acknowledged her name. She wasn't a colleague anymore. She was the bad memory no one wanted to trigger. The platform buzzed with evening commuters, some checking TikTok on cracked iPhones, others blank-faced behind AirPods. Seren kept near the edge, scanning faces. That's when it happened. A jolt. A hand, not a bump. She stumbled forward with such force, her knees buckled. The inbound train from 95th Dan Ryan had just rounded the bend, its headlights searing like a warning too late. Seren's hand hit the yellow safety bumps, nails scraping the rough surface. Another hand, different, strong, pulled her back with a force that knocked her to the ground. Her breath came in gasps, chest burning, arms shaking. A woman with a northwestern hoodie crouched beside her, asking if she needed help. Seren could barely nod. The man who pulled her vanished into the crowd before she saw his face. The train roared past like a missed execution. Her scarf had fallen, and her coat was wide open, but she felt nothing except the twist in her gut. That wasn't an accident. That was a message, a warning, or worse, a trial balloon. She sat still for a long time, her knees pressed to her chest, until an employee in a CTA jacket asked her to move. She did, but not far. She needed to sit with what had almost happened. She climbed the stairs back into the city night, back into a version of Chicago she no longer recognized, where the justice system she once served now circled like a wolf with no collar. Inside her apartment near North Dammon and Evergreen, she double-locked the door and sat at her kitchen table, where the kettle still hadn't been fixed since December. She didn't boil water, she didn't turn on the lights, she just pulled out the file again. Dashiell Rivas. Murder charge, 200-level felony. Conviction based on testimonial evidence and circumstantial timelines. Serene had believed it because she was told it was solid. She'd trusted the forensics, trusted her mentor, trusted the system that now left her breathless at the edge of train tracks. She flipped through the pages, past the black and white photo of the victim, past the timeline. Her eyes stopped on a name she hadn't thought about in years, Lisa Montrose, the key witness. She remembered her as shy, hesitant, not a liar, but afraid. Serene had dismissed the inconsistencies back then. Now they itched under her skin like something half-healed. That name was the thread. That name was where she'd start. Because someone had tried to kill her for being in that courtroom today. And whoever they were, they hadn't expected her to survive. She sat there long past midnight, the city murmuring outside. Wicker Park was quieter in the off-season, less music, more silence. But her thoughts wouldn't stop. For the first time in years, she wasn't trying to rebuild her reputation. She was trying to stay alive. The case had never been about Dashiell Rivas. It had been about the people who needed him to disappear. And now that he was out, someone wanted both of them gone. Seren scribbled Lisa's name onto a post-it and stuck it to her fridge. Below it, she added 3 more. Raymond Calhoun, her old supervisor, Unit 14 Evidence Locker, and December 17th, the day of the original verdict. The fridge door clicked shut like punctuation. She closed her eyes briefly, just long enough to see Dashiell's face again, the way he looked at her outside the courthouse, like someone who had made peace with pain, but not with her. And somewhere in that memory, buried under layers of guilt and exhaustion, was the seed of something worse than regret. Responsibility, not just for what had happened, but for what would come next. She wouldn't sleep that night, but she would remember every word of what he said. You had certainty, Ed. And that certainty buried me. Serene waited at a 2-person table in the back corner of Buddy's Place, a forgettable coffee shop just off Adams Street near the Harold Washington Library. The place had once tried to rebrand itself as a student hangout, judging by the half-faded Columbia College flyers still taped to the wall, but the clientele was mostly postal workers, paralegals, and night-shift transit cops grabbing caffeine before the city swallowed them whole again. The heater clicked like it was coughing, barely working, and her hands stayed wrapped around the paper cup of weak black coffee like it might keep her anchored. She hadn't texted Dashiell. She didn't have his number. She had left a note with the public defender's office and hoped the gamble would work. When he stepped in, 30 minutes late, wearing a thrifted North Face jacket and carrying nothing but keys in his pocket, she felt like she was looking at someone who had trained himself to walk slowly through a world that moved too fast. He spotted her immediately and sat without a word, arms folded tight across his chest. "I don't expect anything," she said quickly, "except maybe 10 minutes. He didn't nod, but he didn't leave either. That was more than she deserved. She didn't waste time. She slid the folder across the table, an old one, the kind given at seminars, torn slightly at the edge. Inside were photocopies of the original case file, news clippings from the Chicago Tribune, and a page torn from a spiral notebook. She watched his eyes fall to that page. Names, times, dates, her own handwriting from back when her belief in the system hadn't yet curdled into something quieter. "I found inconsistencies," she said. "I ignored them. I believed in the testimony because it came pre-wrapped. I never questioned who tied the bow." He didn't touch the folder. His hands stayed still, fingers pressed to the edge of the table. "You're not the one I want forgiveness from," he finally said, voice flat. "That's good," Seren replied, pulling out a printout from her purse. "Because this isn't about forgiveness. It's about staying alive." She handed him a still from CTA security footage, blurry, low resolution, but clearly showing her body stumbling toward the train tracks at Roosevelt Station. "Someone tried to kill me yesterday." Dashiell finally looked up, his face unreadable. "Then you're getting close," he said, like it was obvious. They didn't talk about trust. Neither of them had that kind of luxury anymore, but they talked about Lisa Montrose, the prosecution's key witness, the girl who claimed to see Dashiell fleeing the scene. Seren pulled out another sheet, this one a transcription of Lisa's original interview. "There were inconsistencies even then," she murmured. "She mentioned hearing the shot before she turned the corner. That doesn't match the location of the entry wound or the angle of fire." Dashiell's eyes flicked over the paper. She was 19. "They scared her," he said, "not as accusation, just as fact." "She was terrified when I cross-examined her," Seren admitted, swallowing hard. "And I thought that meant she was lying, but she was just cornered." Dashiell leaned back. "You really want to reopen this?" he asked. "Because the people who buried me, they're not going to shrug and walk away. They'll burn everything to keep it buried." Seren nodded. "And someone already tried." There was a long pause before he answered. "You destroyed my life," he said, almost gently. "So if you're offering to let me destroy yours back, fine, but don't call it justice." Seren met his eyes and said quietly, "Then let's call it even." They walked together up Michigan Avenue, not speaking for the first few blocks. The wind pushed against their coats, and street performers played off-key saxophone outside the Millennium Park L stop. For a moment, they looked like any two exhausted co-workers heading home, except neither of them could remember the last time they had a home worth going to. "I live off Darman," she said, "up near Evergreen. It's not much, but it's quiet." He gave a dry chuckle. "Quiet sounds like a lie." Still, he followed her. They passed the Art Institute, where a wedding party in rented tuxes posed for photos in front of the lions. Dashiell watched the scene for a beat too long. "Do you know what it's like," he asked, voice low, "to forget how your sister's voice sounded just because you weren't allowed a phone call for 8 months?" Seren looked at him but didn't interrupt. "She left Chicago, Colorado now. Sends postcards. I don't write back." She didn't respond with sympathy, just walked a step closer and said, "Then help me make this count for something." He didn't answer, but he didn't turn away. Her apartment was on the third floor of a beige walk-up with a busted intercom. She buzzed them in manually, and Dashiell lingered in the stairwell for a second before following. Inside, everything was clean in that don't-touch-anything kind of way. Books stacked like bricks on the counter, no pictures on the walls. She offered him tea, and he refused. "No need to pretend we're friends," he said. She didn't argue. Instead, she walked to a drawer in the hallway desk and pulled out a battered legal pad, the yellow kind that curled at the corners. "This," she said, "was my warboard. Every major case, every name, every win." She flipped to a page halfway through. His name was there, underlined. "Why keep it?" he asked. She shrugged. "Because I needed to remember what I'd done, and because I thought someday maybe I'd have the courage to erase it." He stepped closer, glanced at the page, then looked at her. "You haven't erased it. Not yet." He stared at the name, the pressure of silence between them building like something physical. Then he looked away, walked to the window and said, "If we're doing this, we do it my way. No shortcuts, no protecting your own." She folded the pad shut. "Then we're doing it." Neither of them slept that night. He left just past midnight, saying nothing, leaving no trace. But the name stayed open on the pad for hours after he was gone. Seren sat at the kitchen table, cross-legged on the chair, holding a pen in her right hand like it might cut her if she dared use it. She didn't strike through his name. She didn't highlight it either. She just stared at it, the ink from years ago still dark and angry. That name was more than a record. It was an indictment of who she had been and who she might still be. Across the room, the folder remained on the counter, pages splayed, the corner stained from when her coffee had spilled earlier. Dashiell hadn't taken it with him. That meant something. Maybe he wanted her to study it again. Maybe he didn't trust her yet. Maybe he never would. But he was willing to walk into the fire with her, and that was something she hadn't earned, not even close. Still, it had been offered. She finally pushed back the chair, folded the legal pad shut, and tucked it into the drawer again. The agreement had been made. Not with forgiveness. Not with trust, just with ash, and the promise of whatever could be built from what burned. They didn't talk much anymore. Not in ways that filled silence. Their version of conversation was now made of page flips, exchanged glances and quiet mutterings when something lined up. The Harold Washington Library Center had become their neutral ground, a place big enough to disappear inside, where old city records, court archives, and pre-digitized microfilms were still buried like bones, waiting to be unearthed. On the third floor, in a narrow aisle marked Legal Proceedings, 1998-2008, Dashiell read old trial logs like they were cautionary tales. He'd lean over a court clerk's log and point without comment. Serene would take notes furiously in her black moleskin, margins growing dense with questions she didn't want to ask out loud. Dashiell remembered details no man should carry for 10 years. Lisa Montrose's hesitations on the stand, the order in which the detectives questioned him, the strange pause after the coroner's cross-examination. "She cried before the verdict," he said once, almost offhand. "Not because I was guilty, but because she knew she'd lied." Seren didn't answer. She just looked down at her notes. She didn't remember Lisa's tears, but she remembered her own closing argument. She remembered calling that testimony unshakable. It had won her applause. It had stolen his life. It was Dashiell who spotted the archive box marked Supplementals, Audio, Unverified. It sat beneath a rusted shelf near the staff copier, half covered by a set of outdated zoning maps. Seren pried it open, coughing as the dust lifted, and pulled out a handful of mini cassettes in cracked plastic cases. "They never digitized these?" she asked, incredulous. Dashiell didn't respond. He was already digging through the labels. One caught his attention. Montrose, Lisa, initial statement, Revenet. The tape looked warped, but the label was intact. Dated 6 days after Lisa's original police interview, yet it was never submitted in discovery. Serene pulled out an old Sony microcassette player from her bag, the kind kept in DA offices out of habit more than need. She plugged in a pair of cheap earbuds, $12 from Walgreens on Ashland, and hit play. The hiss came first, then the voice. Lisa's, small, panicked, and then something else. A man's voice, calm, rehearsed, deliberate. Serene's blood went cold. You didn't see the moment of impact, that's not what matters. You saw the result, that's what counts in court. Serene yanked out the earbuds like they burned. She knew that voice, knew it down to the cadence. Raymond Calhoun, her former supervisor, her mentor, the man who had shaped her into a rising star, the one who taught her never to bend, except clearly he had. Serene didn't speak right away. She stood there, eyes fixed on the cassette player like it might come alive and strangle her. Dashiell saw her expression and didn't ask. He already understood. "Someone in your circle did this," he said flatly, "and you just heard his voice." Serene sat down heavily on the nearest bench, cassette still clutched in one hand. "He told me the Lisa timeline was airtight," she whispered. "He told me the inconsistencies were just courtroom nerves." Dashiell leaned against the shelf, arms crossed. "So he used you, made you the perfect tool. You had a clean record, a sharp tongue, and a need to believe the machine worked." She flinched. "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Turn my belief into a character flaw." His gaze didn't soften. It was. She stared at the player again. "He built me to be incorruptible. Turns out, he just built me to carry the weight when the house of cards fell." The silence between them became thick, almost unbearable. Dashiell finally broke it. "So what now?" Serene looked up, eyes glassy but dry. "Now we prove I wasn't the only one with blood on my hands. And that starts with Lisa. If she still exists in the city, she's the next crack in the wall." They left the library without checking anything out. Serene clutched the cassette like a relic that could damn or deliver her, and Dashiell walked beside her with the tension of someone used to holding invisible fences in his chest. Outside, the snow had started falling again, thicker this time. They headed east towards State Street in silence, the air too full of ghosts to bother speaking. At the corner of Van Buren, Serene flagged down the 29 State bus heading northbound, less foot traffic, easier to blend. They sat at the back, the bus only half full. The driver, a woman with red nails and a Cubs beanie, barely looked at them. Dashiell stared out the window while Serene kept the tape in her lap, thumb tapping lightly against its corner. "You think she'll talk?" she asked finally. "Lisa?" He didn't look away. "She lied under oath. But she was also manipulated. She was 19. You were, what, 30? 28? Then you know how easy it is to believe someone who wears authority like armor." Serene didn't answer. She was thinking about Calhoun's office, about the way he closed doors before offering advice, about the email threads that never made it into official files, about how often she'd chosen to trust silence instead of pulling at threads. Dashiell looked over finally. "You're shaking." "Not from cold," she replied, eyes fixed on her reflection in the scratched window, and he didn't offer warmth. He just sat a little closer. By the time the bus neared North Avenue, the city had begun to vanish under snow. It wasn't beautiful. It was suffocating. Serene pressed the cassette into her coat pocket, deep where it couldn't be snagged or spotted. As they stepped off at Clark Street, her boot slid slightly on the curb, and Dashiell instinctively reached out, not grabbing, just steadying with presence. She caught herself, nodded, and walked on. They were not people who talked about trust, but sometimes that's what silence meant. The walk to her apartment was short, and once inside, she dropped her bag by the door like it weighed too much. "There's a thumb drive in the desk," she said. "If we can get this tape converted digitally, we can clean the audio and maybe trace Calhoun's timestamps." "There's a guy I know," Dashiell said. Used to run diagnostics for the PD before they laid him off. Does freelance now. Works out of a laundromat on Western. Seren raised an eyebrow. That sounds like a trap. It's Chicago, he replied. Everything's a trap. But sometimes the people in them don't like being caged either. She didn't smile, but for the first time, she felt like maybe this wasn't just a reckoning. Maybe it was a rescue. For both of them. Serene didn't cry that night. That would come later. But something had cracked. As she sat at the edge of her bed, watching snow paint blurry streaks across the glass, the weight in her chest no longer felt like pure guilt. It was layered now, with betrayal, with revelation, with the terrible clarity that she had been selected, shaped, and sent into courtrooms like a weapon, her own righteousness sharpened by someone else's rot. She replayed the voice in her head. Calhoun's careful modulation, the way he never asked Lisa to lie, just to see it differently. She thought about the way Dashiell looked at her now, not with forgiveness, but with comprehension. With the resigned knowledge of someone who had finally been handed the name of his executioner, and yet he hadn't walked away. Not after hearing the tape. Not after seeing her nearly collapse under its weight. He had stayed. That mattered. When she turned off the light and lay back, she didn't close her eyes. The darkness didn't offer rest. But her last thought was this: I wasn't collateral. I was design. And beside her, in silence, Dashiell sat in the kitchen, still listening to the tape again on her spare earbuds. Not because he needed to, but because now someone else finally could. Serene had rehearsed the statement at least 30 times, alone in her kitchen, pacing between the fridge and the table, where the old legal pad still sat like a relic of guilt. But the words hadn't changed. Only her voice had. That morning, she stood once more at the bottom of the Daily Center steps, not as a prosecutor, not as a fallen star, but as someone ready to be gutted in full view of the city. News vans lined Washington Street, their antennas twitching like scavengers in a feeding ground. Across the plaza, camera crews clustered like insects, and the same courthouse door she used to stride through now felt like a threshold into fire. Dashiell was already there, waiting on the granite ledge beside the steps, his posture different from before. Not stiff but steady, unshackled in every sense. He didn't say a word when she approached. He didn't need to. His presence was its own testimony. Inside, reporters scrambled as she walked through the rotunda, past the mosaic seal of Cook County, and toward the press podium she'd asked the Public Integrity Office to set up. There was no legal requirement to do this publicly. But if she was going to name names, tear open the system that once protected her, and confess that she helped build a lie, it had to be here, loud, unmistakable. The statement began with her name, rank, and resignation. Not because anyone demanded it, but because no one should be allowed to wear a badge once they'd turned it into a weapon. She laid it out cleanly. How Raymond Calhoun had manipulated the Lisa Montrose testimony, how tapes had been buried, how internal protocols at the time allowed evidence to be redirected if flagged by supervisors as not credible, a vague term that had been weaponized against fairness. Her voice didn't waver, though her spine ached from holding in too much. She explained how her faith in the structure had made her blind, how she had presented timelines and cross-examinations with the false certainty of someone who didn't know she was being used. She detailed the moment she heard his voice on that tape, how it split the past and the present like a wire through bone. And then she said the words no one expected. I knowingly built my closing argument on a testimony I now believe was tainted. I did not fabricate it, but I ignored every instinct that told me something was off, and in doing so, I destroyed a man's life. Dashiell Rivas was innocent. Behind the cameras, the room went still. It was the kind of silence that didn't wait for applause. It waited for collapse. The consequences came swiftly, like a dam cracking under weight. By the time she stepped off the podium, emails were flying through state offices. Her resignation was accepted by 2 p.m. The Office of Legal Ethics issued an immediate suspension pending investigation. A special committee would review her entire case history, and somewhere in an office upstairs, Raymond Calhoun was being escorted from his corner suite by 2 silent men in suits with no pins. That night, the story would lead both the Tribune and ABC7's 5 o'clock segment, not because of the corruption, that was old news in Chicago, but because of the confession. No one confesses in this city, not unless they're broken or brave or both. Seren was both. As she walked out into the cold, her phone buzzing non-stop in her coat pocket, Dashiell waited at the foot of the steps. The plaza was thinning now, the reporters chasing fresh quotes or writing copy on benches. The snow had paused for a moment, like the weather was holding its breath. She stopped in front of him, breath visible in short puffs. For once, he didn't look like he was carrying 10 years on his back. He looked undecided, and that, somehow, felt like hope. He didn't speak. He just reached for her hand, not in forgiveness, not in reunion, but like someone holding a decision rather than a grudge. His fingers were calloused. Hers were trembling. The contact was brief, but neither pulled away. "You didn't have to do that," he said finally. She nodded. "I did." A beat passed. "Do you regret it?" She thought for a long second. "I regret the years you lost, not this." He didn't smile, not exactly, but something softened. "They'll try to bury you now," he said, "like they buried me." "Let them try," she replied. "But this time, I brought a shovel." He chuckled once, quiet, surprised by his own reaction. They turned and walked west toward Clark Street. The plaza behind them faded into noise, but the space between them had changed. It wasn't wide anymore. It was lived in, shared. At the light, when it turned green, he reached for her hand again. This time she took it fully. Back in Wicker Park, the night felt different. Not healed, just less haunted. The kind of night where some things end and others can, tentatively, begin. They entered her apartment with no ceremony. The legal pad was still there on the desk, the drawer slightly ajar like it had been waiting. Seren walked straight to it. She didn't hesitate this time. She pulled out the page, the one with his name underlined twice, bold and final, and tore it clean down the middle. Then she opened a new sheet, picked up the black gel pen she used when she wanted the ink to last, and wrote, "Never again use certainty as a weapon." She didn't sign it. She didn't have to. She placed it gently in the drawer, closed it softly, and turned to find Dashiell watching her. "That your new closing statement?" he asked. "My new opening," she replied. He nodded once. "Good." He didn't say goodbye when he left the room for a moment. He simply stood beside her at the window, both of them watching the city reassemble itself beneath them, sirens at a distance, windows lit in small, private flickers. He rested his forehead against hers, a gesture with no pretense, no demand. Just 2 people not asking for anything beyond the moment. It wasn't a kiss, it was steadier than that. A kind of quiet contract. The past hadn't vanished, but it had been witnessed. And perhaps that was the first step to building something that could survive. Not perfect, not polished, but possible. 2 names no longer written in ink against each other, but beside. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Dashiell closed his eyes, like someone finally allowed to rest, and Seren, torn open, stripped of every title, stood still and let the truth hold.